Peter loved science, especially anything weird and wacky. He would spend hours reading about strange experiments and bizarre inventions. His room was filled with science kits and books about the mysteries of the universe. So when his class visited the famous Professor Von Time's exhibit, he could hardly contain his excitement. This was the moment he had been waiting for all year. Peter was bursting with excitement. He had heard so many stories about Professor Von Time and his incredible inventions. Professor Von Time was known for his wacky inventions, especially his time machine. The professor's creations were the stuff of legends, and Peter had always dreamed of seeing them up close.
Don't touch anything, warned Mrs. Thompson, their strict teacher. She was always very particular about following the rules. Everyone was scared of Mrs. Thompson. Her strict demeanor and no-nonsense attitude made her one of the most feared teachers in the school. She had a voice like a foghorn and a stare that could melt ice. No one dared to disobey her.
Peter, distracted by a giant bubbling machine, couldn't help but be drawn to it. The machine was unlike anything he had ever seen before. He wandered away from his classmates, his curiosity getting the better of him. He was so fascinated that he didn't even notice he was alone. He peeked behind a curtain and gasped. What he saw took his breath away. There it was, the legendary time machine, the very invention he had read about so many times. It looked like a giant silver toilet bowl with buttons and levers. Peter couldn't believe his eyes. This was the moment he had always dreamed of. Uh-oh. Peter couldn't resist the temptation. He reached out and pulled a mysterious lever in the science lab. Suddenly, lights flashed brightly, and the machine whirred to life with a loud hum. Peter felt a strange tingling sensation all over his body, like 1,000 ants crawling over him. He looked down and shrieked in horror.
He was a little kid again. His clothes were now too big for him.
Before he could react or even comprehend what had happened, Mrs. Thompson appeared out of nowhere.
Peter, what on earth are you doing behind there? She boomed, her voice echoing in the room.
Peter tried to explain the bizarre situation, but Mrs. Thompson just frowned, clearly not believing him.
Stop being ridiculous, Peter, she scoffed. Now, come along. We have important things to do. It's time for the science demonstration, and I need everyone to be ready.
No way! Peter trailed behind the class, horrified. He was small again, stuck in his 10-year-old body. He imagined Mrs. Thompson making him sit with the little kids during the demonstration. He would die of embarrassment.
He had to get back to that machine.
As Mrs. Thompson droned on about the wonders of temporal mechanics, Peter saw his chance. He ducked behind a display of miniature robots and made a run for it.
Ha ha!
Peter scrambled back to the time machine. He had no idea which lever he had pulled, but he mashed them all. Lights flashed even brighter, and the machine shook violently.
Peter, what have you done?
But it wasn't his teacher's booming voice. It was a tiny, squeaky voice. Peter turned around and saw a little girl. Mrs. Thompson, now the size of a third grader, stood there in shock. Her hair was a mess, her glasses were askew, and her clothes were comically oversized.
Peter, explain yourself this instant.
But before Peter could speak, the other students noticed. They gasped, then burst into laughter. Mrs. Thompson was no longer the towering figure of authority she once was. She was just a tiny, fuming little girl in an adult's clothing, her once imposing presence now reduced to a comical sight. The students, especially those who had felt her wrath, couldn't contain their amusement. They pointed, laughed, and whispered among themselves, their giggles echoing through the classroom.
What happened? How did she get so small?
The teacher's aide, a kind-faced woman named Miss Penny, rushed over, her eyes wide with concern and a hint of amusement. Mrs. Thompson, now shorter than Miss Penny's waist, stamped her foot and wailed, her voice high-pitched and frantic.
Peter messed with the time machine. He must have said it wrong.
But her protests were drowned out by the children's laughter, their joy uncontainable at the sight of their shrunken teacher. Miss Penny, stifling a giggle, took charge of the chaotic scene, trying to restore some semblance of order.
All right, everyone, settle down. Let's try to figure this out.
She said, trying to sound stern, but the corners of her mouth betrayed her amusement. But it was no use. The students were too caught up in the hilarity of the situation to pay attention. The sight of their once intimidating teacher, reduced to a fuming miniature version of herself, was simply too funny. And as for Peter, well, he couldn't help but crack a smile himself, proud of his unintended prank. It seemed like Mrs. Thompson was finally getting a taste of her own medicine. The classroom buzzed with excitement, and for once, the students felt like they had the upper hand. Miss Penny tried to console the frustrated Mrs. Thompson, but it was clear that the day's events would be remembered for a long time. The students would talk about this day for weeks, sharing the story of the tiny teacher with anyone who would listen. Eventually, the classroom began to settle down, but the memory of Mrs. Thompson's transformation would linger, a reminder of the unexpected twists that can happen in the most ordinary of days.